Hello, everyone. Happy February 29th. We'll see each other 4 years from now on the same day. So today we thought that it would be really interesting to explore what leap years actually mean, scientifically, mythologically, traditionally. In different cultures, there are certain beliefs that are held. And so that's the presentation that we have for you today. We welcome you. As always, it is a pleasure to have you here. We want to acknowledge once again the contribution that the foundation makes. This lunch is sponsored by them. And of course, we have the best speaker ever, Rumya, with us. She always says, oh, I don't know if I can get a speaker. It might just be little old me. And I tell her, you are their favorite speaker. So enjoy, sit back, relax, and let's learn something.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I appreciate it. And yes, I couldn't find anybody to speak about leap years, so it was me. So this presentation comes with a couple disclaimers. One is, as most of you know, I'm the Director of Environmental Science at the Foundation, key being environmental science. This has nothing to do with that. So this is a little outside my wheelhouse. Also, I called it the science and mythology of the leap years. It's really more history and superstition. I do talk about the science a little bit, but it's a lot of math and it's really boring, so I didn't really want to get into that. So I'll touch on that, but I'm not really going to talk that much about it. It's mostly about the history, which is, I think, a little bit more interesting. What we're going to talk about first is the measurement of time and sort of how we got into the situation with leap years. The history of calendars specifically, because that's extremely relevant as to why we use leap years. We also do other things besides leap year, or leap days, I should say. The science of the leap year, I have like 2 slides on that. I won't stay on it very long. Leap months, days, and seconds. These are all things that exist or have existed. And then finally, we'll talk about some myths, legends, and superstitions, some folklore that goes along with leap years. So first, the measurement of time. Time is arbitrary as far as the way we measure it. As humans, we have sort of made it up as we go, based, obviously on our observations. So the length of time in a day, which, as you know, days are longer in the summer and shorter in the winter. So that itself is not necessarily a good measurement of time. When you're looking at the movement of the sun or the moon, that's a little bit more accurate, but they also go through cycles, so not necessarily. And it also, the cycle of the moon doesn't match up with the seasons. So if you're looking for seasons, then that's not necessarily a good way of measuring time. And then, of course, just using the seasons themselves. There's also the fact that the Earth's rotation varies by, I'm not going to try to say this, 5 zeros and a 6. 5 zeros following a period and a 6. But that works out to, I think it's like less than a second. But it varies on an annual basis. And this ends up changing the way that we end up measuring our leap things. As I said, months, days, and seconds. Historically, calendars have been measured using solar, lunar, and or lunisolar, which takes both into account, types of calendars. Now we do it astronomically. The Gregorian calendar, which I'll talk about, is what's mostly accepted worldwide. This is an example of a medieval calendar. Super complicated. I was actually reading this website that teaches you how to read this, and it gave me a headache. So this one specifically is based on Latin Christendom. It basically notes religious events and auspicious days, things like that. And it's its own sort of time. It measures time in its own way, and it changes. They would change it periodically. They'd make notes. They would make new pages. It was sort of a living document, and it would change as each year went on because it didn't follow exactly with the seasons or with the spring equinox, which turns out to be very important in a lot of cultures. These are old sundials. These aren't necessarily used, obviously, for measuring annual events, but this is like keeping daily time. These can be actually very accurate, depending, not these two specifically, these are pretty simple, but you can actually have very, very accurate sundials that will tell you the exact time. But this is just another way, especially in like earlier times, 1,000 years ago, ways that people could keep track of time during the day. But again, time is subjective, and somebody that's in Alaska is not going to measure time the same way as somebody at the equator. You can go 4 months of the year with no sun in Alaska. That doesn't happen at the equator. You have sun all the time and no seasons, basically. So then, when you're looking at actual measurement of time, there's a few different ways that you can do it. The solar tropical year, which is what we use mostly, is 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 46 seconds. That's the year that is used for most astronomical calendars, which the Gregorian calendar is, which we use. The sidereal year is 365 days, 6 hours, and 9 minutes, and 10 seconds. Slightly longer, and that just has to do with the way that they're measured. Both of them are measured as the Earth goes around the sun. But one of them specifically goes from vernal equinox to vernal equinox, and the other one is just a measurement of the actual distance gone. And then there's lunar years, and that has to do with lunations, which is an entire cycle of the moon, which I have right here. So it goes basically from new moon to new moon is one lunation. And those happen in cycles of 12 also, but on a much shorter year, so 354 days. All of this is relevant when I get into calendars. So, calendars, the history of calendars. This is where I sort of got into the weeds quite a bit. So what I'm giving you is a very brief history, and I am leaving out a lot because I could probably, give you an entire 700-page book on this information. But I'm going to give you the points that I think are most relevant and important for us because we're talking about leap years. So obviously, you all know what calendars are. They're a way of keeping track of complex cycles, mostly of the moon and sun, but also seasons. It's a way of dividing up time in a way that sort of makes sense for civilization. And we've done this for thousands of years for, keeping track of agricultural seasons, religious events, business, domestic things, all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of reasons, obviously, to be able to keep track of your days, months, and seasons. The history of calendars goes back at least 10,000 years that we know of. So back to the Neolithic period. This little stone here, these etchings on the side, these little marks, they represent, as far as we can tell, or archaeologists can tell, I am not one of them, so I shouldn't say we, that they represent lunar cycles and solar cycles. And these were, just small stones, so they're portable. It's basically carrying a portable calendar in your pocket. And then there are also cave paintings, which we'll get into in a second, that show of the same era, also roughly 10,000, 11,000 years ago, which show lunar cycles. Now these cave paintings, there's at least 600 Ice Age cave paintings found all over Europe. There's probably more than that haven't been found or have been caved in or whatever. And they show a lot of animals. And what they were finding for quite a few of these is that you can't see it in this picture. I couldn't find a good picture of it. But there are these little markings, like somewhere on here, that are like little dots and dashes next to each other. And initially, this is all pre-written language. So the assumption was that was maybe a signature. But the problem is that means that there's this one artist that's running all over Europe and painting in caves, or a very similar artist or something, So it's really unlikely that it was a signature. And it went studied for years and years before finally it was actually an amateur archaeologist that figured out that those markings represent the lunar cycle. And what they were actually tracking was the mating and reproducing cycles of these animals, because some of them were possibly farmed at the time, I don't really know, but also very important for hunting and things like that. So they were tracking these animals when they bred, probably when they're vulnerable, when they might be producing milk, when they are easier to hunt, all that kind of stuff. So understanding their life cycle is very important. And they tied that in with the lunar cycle, and that's what they were actually tracking, and that's what was being painted all over these walls. I thought that was super interesting. Also, I think these look so cool. Just me. But I mean, you look at that, and that just looks like somebody was trying to make, just a picture, because they're like overlapping. There doesn't seem to be any order here, but apparently, if you're an archaeologist, you can tell there is apparently some kind of order. About 10,000 years ago, the Neolithic / just after the last ice age, we get into Sumerian and Babylonian calendars, and that's from the Mesopotamian area, which is where current day Iran and Iraq and sort of that area is. And that was roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. These pictures here, this is a Sumerian calendar, and these are fragments of a Babylonian calendar. So this is where we're now getting into written language, and so they can actually track things more carefully as far as like their calendars. And then these were then followed by Egyptian, Assyrian, and Elamite calendars within the next 1,000 years or so. And here, these are reproductions of Egyptian calendars. You can see they're really complicated. And a lot of calendars you'll see are in circular form, and that's obviously when you're following an entire cycle and starting over from the beginning, the circular form makes sense for that. But then, they cram everything into here, and unless you know what all of these little things mean, it looks really, really complicated. But I'm sure if we were from ancient Egypt, we would know exactly what that means. And this one, I have no idea what they're doing here, but that is apparently also a reproduction of a different type of reproduction of Egyptian calendar. This one is an Assyrian calendar, very similar to the Sumerian calendars. And this one is the Elamite calendar. That is written in cuneiform, which was one of the earliest written languages known, also from the Mesopotamian area. All of these are from Mesopotamia, basically, or that area, surrounding area. So this is kind of a very brief sort of timeline of where modern day calendars have come from. And this is leaving out, like I said, quite a lot. There are certainly other influences that are not included here, but this is just to give you a general idea. So going back to the Iron Age, which is roughly 2000 BC or 1200 BC, you get these calendars from the East. So there is Asian influence also in these calendars. And then, as I mentioned, there's the Babylonian calendars from Mesopotamia. Those influence, and the other ones I mentioned also, influence the Persian calendars. And then from there, Zoroastrian calendars, which is also sort of slightly more modern Persian calendars. And the Hebrew calendar also, they're from the same area again. They're influenced. And then that leads to, that leads to the Roman calendar, which was then changed by Julius Caesar. And that, of course, leads to the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use today. Now, this is all European calendars that I'm talking about here. Obviously, this isn't taking into account anything happening in South America, for instance, or in North America, or anywhere else that's not in that area. But the reason I'm leaving that out for now, and I will mention some of it a little bit later, is because when it comes to why we have leap years, this is more relevant. And the Gregorian calendar, this is its timeline, so this is where the influence comes from. So, moving forward, we're getting closer to modern day calendars. Julius Caesar is known as the person to introduce the leap year. He took the Roman calendar and played around with it. They had this weird idea that even numbers were not lucky. So they didn't want a year that ended in an even number. So the number of days would have to be an odd number. And what they did was they alternated the days of the month between 29 days and 31 days for all the months. The problem with that is that you end up with an even number at the end of the year of days. You end up with 366 or 64 or something. They ended up changing February to 28 days for a number of reasons. It's also, I think, the day that they celebrate their death rituals or something, so it was already not a great month, considered unlucky on its own. So that one was going to be an even number, 28 days, and that worked it out so that it was 365 days. Now the problem that they ran into was that very slowly they found that the spring equinox was moving closer and closer each year into winter. And they're like, well, this is a problem. That shouldn't be happening, obviously. And the problem was that there are not 365 days in a year. There's a little bit more than that, but not quite 366. So Julius Caesar added a leap year to the end of February. It was already short a day, it was already lacking, and needed some attention. So he's like, well, okay, if we're gonna add an extra year, let's do it, or an extra day, let's do it that month. And that was every 4 years. So he added that, and it was every 4 years, without fail, every 4 years. Now that comes up with another problem, which I'll get into in a little while. But that problem was fixed, more or less, with the Gregorian calendar that was introduced in 1582, where it's refined a little bit more. It's very similar, still has leap years and everything, has the same, obviously now we know there are days that are 30, or months that are 30 days and 31 days as opposed to 29 and 31. But also the leap years have been adjusted slightly. So very quickly, the science of the leap year, and I'll explain how the Gregorian calendar has adjusted it to make it make sense. It may not make sense to you. Don't feel bad, it took me a while. I had to go through this quite a few times. So the tropical year, which is the same as the solar year, which I mentioned earlier, that was the one that was 365 days, 5 hours, 9 minutes, something like that. That's basically the astronomical year. That's what we use for calendars. It goes from vernal equinox to vernal equinox. If you look at it in decimals, it is 365.24219 days. So to make up for this extra piece of a day, we add 1 day every 4 years, the leap year. That's what Julius Caesar did, and that made sense. The problem is this. So now what we're doing is adding a quarter of a day, but what we're actually missing is slightly less than a quarter of a day. So after 4 years, you have this much extra days. It's roughly equivalent to about 11 minutes. Theoretically not a big deal. After about 100 years, that equals almost a day. So after 100 years, you run into a problem. So to fix this, the Gregorian calendar removed leap years from any century year. So any year that ends in 00, 1000, 1100, 1200, 1700, 1800, those years do not have a leap year. It's skipped over. However, that overcorrects the overcorrection. So to fix that, they added back in the leap years in years that are divisible by 400. These are all divisible by 100. These are divisible by 100, but also by 400. So these have leap years. These don't have leap years. And then every 4 years, aside from these years, we have a leap year. And that mostly fixes it. I'm not going to go any farther into that math because that's headache-inducing. The most important thing to remember is that the introduction of a leap year, the entire point of it, is to keep the calendar year in line with the seasons. That's what's most important for basically everything that we do. Knowing when winter's coming, knowing when spring is coming, when can you plant, when can you, plan your business trips, when are the holidays, all of that kind of stuff has to stay in the same general area for our purposes. Again, we're human, Mother Nature doesn't care about our holidays. So this, again, time is arbitrary, we made this up, but this is what works for us. And so we came up with a lot of really weird ways to make it work, but that's how we managed to make it work. Adding and subtracting days and months and all kinds of weird things. Now I'm going to explain a little bit about, I explained why we have leap days. We refer to them as the leap year, but it's just the year that contains the leap day is a leap year. But when we're talking about the actual day, there are also leap months that have happened in the past where they add an entire month to a year, not for us anymore, and leap seconds. So over time, a lot of different civilizations have tried to deal with the drifting calendar where it drifts away from the correct seasons, or from the spring equinox, which is what a lot of these calendars were kind of basing their starting point at, or what the thing that they wanted to match up to was the spring equinox. That was really important in a lot of these civilizations. So when the spring equinox starts drifting back into the winter, they're like, okay, there's a problem. Again, we need to fix the calendar. So here, this is an Athenian calendar, an Attic calendar from ancient Greece. It had 354 days and consisted of 12 months. It's a lunar calendar. That's why it's so short. So the way that they would fix that would be to add a leap month on the 3rd year, the 6th year, the 8th, 11th, 14th, 17th, and 19th years within a 19-year cycle. Now the 19-year Metonic cycle is the cycle of the moon. So the moon goes through its whole, like its phases every single month, every single lunar month, I should say. And it continues to do that for its whole, life, whatever. After 19 years, it basically resets and starts over again. So that's, it's reached its entire huge cycle that it does itself. So that's why it's called a 19-year Metonic cycle. That specifically refers to the cycle the moon goes through. And that's a very common thing in nature. I mean, if you look at the sun, and this doesn't have to do with like revolutions around anything, but the sun itself has an 11-year cycle of sunspots, where at its peak you have the most sunspots, or the most radiation coming off the sun, and then at its lowest point, very, very few sunspots, much less radiation. So cycles like this are very common in nature. The moon has a 19-year one. And then this is how they tracked it. Every 19 years, they would add a random month into these specific years in order to make it match up with the seasons again. So you can get as much as a month off of a season before it's suddenly corrected again. Hebrew calendars followed that exact same strategy. They did the same thing. This is ancient Hebrew calendars. I can't say that that's current. Oh, it is? Okay. So then they still do that, apparently. Greek calendars were also based on the lunar cycle, but way more complicated. I started explaining that, and it took me like 10 slides, and so I took that out because it's really confusing. They also have a second calendar that is specifically for political purposes. It's a completely different timeline in that calendar than their secular calendar, and it was just very complicated. But the ancient Greek calendars, aside from the Athenian one that I just showed you, would follow the lunar cycle, do a lot more weird, complicated things to keep it sort of up to date, and then would keep a second calendar unrelated with its own events. And this is an example of an old Greek calendar, just to show you, like, there's all these different parts to it to keep track of all the different things going on. Now, just briefly touching on, outside of Europe, we have the Aztecs and the Mayans in South America. And they had 2 different calendars also. One was a 260-day calendar, and it specifically marked religious feasts. So it was a religious calendar, completely separate from their secular calendar. Their secular calendar was much more accurate, 365 days. However, they split that into 18 months of 20 days, which only equals 360 days. So you have 5 extra days. So what they would do is take those days and add them in, and I don't know if they did it in a pattern or randomly, but throughout the year they would add in 5 days. The way we add in our leap year, they would do the same thing. At the end of a month, they just tack on an extra day until they had their 5 extra days, so then they had 365 days. So you can see, obviously, like everybody in the world over time has created, their timekeeping calendar, the way that they understand the earth, the way they want to keep track of everything that's happening. And everybody comes up with a similar but different solution. Because it's complicated and it's difficult. Now, because the Julian calendar and ultimately the Gregorian calendars follow the astronomical year, the leap year, as I mentioned, was introduced on February 29th to keep it on track. I think I already explained all of this. I was getting ahead of myself. But basically, the Julian calendars had a leap year every single 4 years, no matter what. The Gregorian calendar fixed that because now the Julian calendar was having the problem where they were getting ahead of themselves. So the spring equinox was getting pushed into the summer slowly instead of back into the winter, which was the problem before. So the Gregorian calendar fixes that and puts it back on track. Other examples of calendars, there's the solar Hijri and Baha'i calendars. Those are from Iran and Iraq, respectively, like that general area. And they introduce leap days only when they need them. So they want to make sure that their spring equinox lands on the correct day. And if it happens to not land on the right day, then they'll just add in a leap day, just to kind of push it in the right direction. And then finally, leap seconds. And we do this nowadays. This is a very modern day thing. We add one roughly every year and a half to get us back on track with UTC time. That's Coordinated Universal Time. And it's because despite all of the adding leap years, removing leap years, adding them back in, and moving everything around, we're still not on track. We're close. But this is how we stay on track. And that is adding a second every so often. And this just shows this since 1971. It's really tiny, but that's 1971. This is how many leap seconds we've added since then to keep ourselves on track. And so that, like I said, that's a very modern day thing. Before it was just a matter of like, well, this doesn't quite work. We can just kind of change the calendar around. There was one point where Julius Caesar deleted 10 days out of October and pissed everybody off, especially the people that had birthdays. They were just like, oh, well, we just lost 10 days of our lives and my birthday doesn't exist anymore. He had a lot of fun with the calendar. Moving on from that, and that actually might be a reason for my first slide here. Again, I'm calling it the mythology of the leap year. So I'm calling it the mythology of the leap year. There's a little bit of mythology in this, but it's mostly kind of folklore and superstitions. If I had done this just on calendars, there's a lot more mythology involved because a lot of the months are named after gods and things like that from the Roman Empire. So there's a lot more interesting actual mythology in there, but this is kind of fun too. So there's a lot of weird and interesting stories around leap year. I just have a few of them here. First of all, a myth that came up several times while I was doing research was that Julius Caesar was assassinated because he added a leap year. Or because he deleted 10 days out of the year. One or the other. People were mad that he messed with the calendar. That's not actually true. He was killed because he was trying to be a dictator and everybody hated him. And this was the picture that you saw on my flyer. This is the murder of Julius Caesar. But yeah, so he was not killed for that reason, but that is something that comes up quite often that people claim as the reason he was killed, because he played too much with the calendar. This was an interesting one, and this is a little bit of mythology that I read about. Saint Bridget of Kildare is credited with getting women to be allowed to propose to their to-be husbands on leap year day, or leap day, sorry. So apparently she complained to St. Patrick that men were taking too long in their courtships and not proposing fast enough, and women were waiting around and it wasn't fair, and they couldn't do anything about it. And originally, he said, okay, well, let's do it this way. Every 7 years, women can propose to men. And she was like, well, that's not good enough. So he changed it to every 4 years, and it fell on Leap Day, February 29th. So this is why it's a very popular tradition, actually, for women to propose on Leap Day. That stemmed from here. Now this was then, it jumped across the little pond to Scotland. Irish monks took this tradition over to Scotland, and Queen Margaret is credited with expanding this to fining men if they said no, if they were proposed to on Leap Day. And that could be anything from being fined a kiss or having to buy a very expensive silk dress. I think there was probably a lot of men hiding out, trying to avoid everybody that day, just to make sure that they didn't have to do that. Queen Margaret is also credited with the idea that women should wear red petticoats on Leap Day. She really took this and ran with it. She came up with a lot of ideas. But what she did, or supposedly did, according to the legend, was taken very seriously and actually in other countries. So in Denmark, a man could be fined a dozen pairs of gloves if he says no on Leap Day, on February 29th. And in Finland, a man would have to give a woman enough fabric to make a nice skirt if he says no to her proposal on Leap Day. I'm a big fan of this. I think this is a good idea. I'd just be going around proposing to everybody, so I just get all this free stuff. But there are some bad superstitions that go along with this also. In particular, in Greece, leap years are just considered bad luck in general, and especially when it comes to marriages. So up to 20% of Greek couples will not get married in a leap year. And this isn't just the day, February 29th. This the entire year is bad luck. So they won't get married. It's very bad for the wedding industry when 20% of your clients just won't get married that year. But that's a superstition that they have there. Scotland also does have a bit of a superstition about it. Leap year was ne'er a good sheep year. It's supposed to be bad for livestock for some reason. I couldn't find a reason why for this. The other one makes a little sense in Greece, because if the traditions are switched and women are proposing, then they can somehow morph that into being bad luck for weddings. But this, I have no idea. It makes no sense to me. And then in Italy, apparently women are crazy. These were both written in Italian. When I found them, I had to translate them. But the two quotes translated to leap year is doom year. And in a leap year, women are erratic. So, take that with a grain of salt, I suppose. But yeah, so apparently for some cultures, leap year is not really good luck. Russia thinks that leap years are scarred with very bad weather, unpredictable bad weather. There was actually a few different articles about this where they compared leap year weather to like non-leap years, and there's no appreciable difference really. But it was kind of an interesting idea. And I read in a few different places that some folklore, and they didn't specify what country this folklore is from, but that the weather specifically changes on every Friday in a leap year, or the changes happen just on Fridays specifically throughout the year in a leap year, which is just kind of a weird and quirky thing. I don't know. I mean, and the fun part about this is that it either means that Florida has leap year every single year, or we just don't fall within the norm. We just kind of do our own thing when it comes to weather. It makes no sense. So yeah, I kind of flew through that, but that's actually my whole talk. So thank you very much. Yes, Ali. Yeah, it's just because it's one day every 4 years, so you have a very low number of people born. And there's some superstitions that were saying that people born that year have bad luck. I read a few things about that. I didn't want to mention that because I just there's nothing to correlate that. It's just a lot of that just goes back in with the superstition, where people think the year is bad luck, so being born on that day is somehow worse. But yeah, I mean, personally, I think it's an interesting sort of quirky thing if you're born on the. All right, well, thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it.